Hello, happy Tuesday. Thank you guys for joining us. Oh, I hear a little echo. Thank you guys for joining us for our annual monthly Talk to Me Tuesday. My name is Simone with Nomis Consulting Group, and we have Chantrice with us from Think Sharp LLC. And today is part two of workplace investigations. So we're going to dive straight into it. We're coming from the employer perspective this month, as we did come from the employee perspective last month. And so we're going to cover some of the same topics, just from a different perspective, as far as whether you're a supervisor, a manager, or anyone in leadership, and what your approaches should be when it comes to workplace investigations. So, Chantrice, take us to the first topic point.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us again for part two. As Simone stated, we are coming from more of the employer perspective. So if you're in a managerial role, any position of leadership, really, this is going to be important for you to kind of take into consideration when we go through these talking points. But what we want to talk about first is the importance of workplace investigations. Obviously, we want to make sure we're maintaining a very safe and respectful work environment at all times, right?
Right.
So when you don't do that, when you don't have, at least a process of some sort to kind of navigate these type of situations, you can very well be exposing yourself to potential legal claims, which in return, hits you financially. It disrupts your reputation. So many things can happen out of not having, an appropriate protocol for performing workplace investigations. So that's why it's important. You're basically trying to mitigate as much risk as possible when it comes to these type of situations. You don't want it to hurt your bottom line, right? So that's what we'll be diving into today, as well as, some potential training and education opportunities that may be available as well, because I know there's a lot of resources out there right now, some free, some paid. It just depends on, your organization and what will better suit you, but there are tons of resources out there. So we can dive straight into the first question. We'll be asking some poll questions as well to kind of gauge from the audience their perspective, and then also getting more information from Simone and her viewpoints as well. So the first one is confidence in current policies. So how confident are you in your organization's current policies and procedures for handling harassment and discrimination complaints? We'll give you a few minutes to answer according to how you feel, but 1 is very confident, 2 is somewhat confident, 3 not confident, and then 4 is unsure.
And we posted some of these questions earlier in the week just to kind of get a perspective as we were coming in to our event today. And this question, we did get a few responses. And unfortunately, 2 and 3 seem to be the consistent between the people that did respond, which didn't surprise me. I mean, ultimately, one of the things I know from my experience being a consultant in HR is that most handbooks, if they have the information on workplace investigations, they're very gray, vague explanations of how the process works, and how to go through it. Some companies I've seen don't even have a way or any documented processes at all on how an employee that may currently be experiencing something, what they should do to report that. And that is a big concern, very alarming from an HR perspective. And for those of you in these managerial and supervisor roles, I challenge you to do some research internally with your companies and see, do you have this process and these policies documented? And it kind of takes us into our next talking point in regards to developing comprehensive policies and the need for it. Clearly, there's a very important and big need to make sure that this process is documented and is consistent with your managers. As someone in leadership, or even as a manager, you should pose that question to those above you. Hey, if I ever come into this situation and we have to start an investigation, what are those steps? Do we have forms and documents already that I just have not seen or been aware of? And if those things aren't in place, then it's time to get HR involved, and we really need to dive into to putting those things and those measures in place. The last thing a company wants to find themselves in a position where you are not consistent and concise with how you're handling every scenario. Yes, all situations are different, but your process and how you deal with them during the investigation period should be pretty much the same. That flow, that work, that process map needs to be spelled out, and whomever is in charge of each component of the workplace investigation needs to know what they're supposed to be doing, how they should be properly documenting, how many people should be in a room. I mean, sometimes you have investigations I've seen take place and it becomes a he said, she said because there was only 2 people in the room versus 3. And I don't think people understand how important that is on both sides, from an employee perspective and very much so from an employer perspective. You want to always cover yourself and make sure you have a witness involved, and that witness is the right type of witness. Is someone that can sit in the most non-biased space possible and is not involved in the situation. And that's typically when HR is in the scenario. If if a manager or supervisor is doing a write-up, depending on how the company is structured, HR is typically brought in during those conversations to avoid confrontation amongst that group, and it can present that third party person. And like what you said, Chantrice, the training has to go along with having those policies and procedures in place. You can't just have them and they sit idle if your team is not trained on how to properly conduct them. Because one error in the process of how it's being conducted can change the outcome of the investigation altogether from the employer perspective. That's from documentation, the way the communication is taking place, terminology and verbiage that's used with communication. Any error in those categories can gravely change the cost of a fine, one way or another, or even down to employment. And if someone's going to be able to stay on board, if they had to be removed from a department or anything along those lines. So having comprehensive policies that you've also trained your staff on is extremely important. And I challenge you as a manager or as a supervisor to see where your company stands when it comes to that. What are your thoughts, Chantrice?
Yeah, and I think I want to stress the importance of also, I love the investigative part of it, making sure anyone in a leadership position is going through your current policy if it exists and just making sure it makes sense. 'Cause I've seen some of these policies, they're written in a way to where it's confusing. The employee doesn't know where to go.
Right.
Or they just work directly with your manager, work with your manager to be vocal about some of these things that you're experiencing. But what if the problem is with your manager? So what do they do after that? You got to make sure. Yeah, you got to make sure it's clear. You got to make sure there's multiple layers to it, I guess, because in the event you do have an employee who wants to issue a complaint about their manager, who can they go to after that? Is it their skip level? Is it their manager's manager? Is there a hotline they can call to be completely anonymous and, maybe want to submit their grievances? Or is there an HR inbox? Like what's the process? So I think making sure, like you said, having a formal policy in place is great. It's important, but doesn't make sense. Like, does the flow, is it clear enough for an employee to know where to go if they do want to be vocal about these things, if they do want to submit these complaints? That's also very important.
I agree. And I also feel like creating the culture and the safe space for them to know once they build up the courage to report these things that they're going to be confidential, and handled with the correct care. I think sometimes we miss out on a lot of things being reported just simply because, like what you said, if my manager is who's harassing me or discriminating against me and you are directing me straight to them, there is no other outlet for me to communicate my grievances. Either A, I'm not going to communicate them, or I've tried to have those conversations with the manager. But if the buck stops here, what else is there for me to do outside of just continuing to be exposed to those things? And as an employer, supervisor, or anyone in leadership, you have to assess your situation and see if that's the case. I think workplace investigations and the processes get put to the side so much because they don't in some organizations, they don't happen often, but there are some organizations where a lot of things are happening. It's just they're not being documented correctly or even make it to the investigative step because there is no clarity on how to get there, or there's no confidentiality or no trust between the employer and the employee experiencing their grievance to even report it. Because and in some, another thing I've seen in small businesses and something that I've even experienced, if my manager is HR or if my manager is HR operations and this, because you wear multiple hats because you're at a small organization, that means, like you said, is there a skip level to who I can speak with? But do you have a CEO or an owner that's like, you need to go take that to HR first? And it's like, yeah, I want to, but that's also my problem. And what their level of involvement is and what they choose, like how they choose to kind of take that information and handle it properly. So again, where are you as an employer, as a supervisor, as a manager when it comes to these steps? And are you providing the necessary mediums for your staff to be able to properly and transparently communicate if they're having that? And I think that kind of takes us into our next poll question when it comes down to, this is about training, but we'll ask this one too, because do you believe training programs adequately prepare your team to handle workplace investigations? And that could be, yes, you have flushed this out. You've managed these policies. You've updated them as things have progressed and changed within the industry. And you know that your managers are prepared. And you have a proof of that because of how things are flowing within your organizations. This could be a somewhat or no training at all. And I know for me, my experience has been a lot of places just they don't have it. People get moved in managerial roles or supervisor roles often, and sometimes knowledge is not necessarily transferred the way I would like it from an HR perspective to be.
Yeah.
But in some of the things that get lost, this tends to be on the list amongst some other things that have more of an HR backing to them, because of course, when you're transferring knowledge, normally from a production perspective, an operations perspective, how to continue to keep things flowing in the business on a day-to-day. However, this can disrupt, doing this, not doing this properly can disrupt your flow and your bottom line at the end of the day. It only takes one, EEOC claim about discrimination and that level of a fine that can make or break the future of some small businesses and some large businesses. And it just, I've seen it. It's not good. So if you're sitting in those roles, do your due diligence and make sure you have things in place. But Chantrese, take us to the next talking point.
So we'll be going over, I know we just discussed training programs. So where are we at? Look, I'm looking at my notes. Confidentiality. So communication and transparency, I believe, is where we are.
Yeah.
So just going back, I know we probably already touched on this, but the importance of confidentiality when it comes to these things, especially workplace investigations. I've seen it where it's mishandled, and someone who's new to a managerial role or a supervisory role, whatever the case may be, doesn't understand the importance of maintaining confidentiality, because in doing so, if you have any lapse in that at all, that does hinder the communication from the employee who's being vocal about these grievances. It hinders the trust that they have in the employer in general to maintain this sense of confidentiality when it comes to these things. It's very sensitive. It's a very sensitive topic most of the time, and it's hard to even come forward and talk about what may be harassing or discriminatory behavior, let alone have a manager who you've reported this to now start to communicate with other parties involved without maintaining that level of confidentiality, only to keep it within, the people who are actually involved, versus kind of like sharing information out, whether it's intentional or not. Maybe they're trying to get feedback on how to handle the situation, but you have to make sure you're definitely maintaining confidentiality. And yes, and communication and transparency, just making sure you are explaining as much as you can the process of reporting these grievances, what the employee can expect out of going through this process according to whatever your internal policy is, and making sure they're comfortable with what all is involved, because there's going to be anyone they mention as a witness is going to be interviewed. Just going through that whole entire process and making sure they understand up front what's about to come out of obviously reporting these grievances.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings when it comes to this particular topic, communication, transparency, and confidentiality, and their involvement in workplace investigations is at the beginning with the person making the grievance, and understanding, depending on the severity of what is happening, witnesses will be brought into the scenario. If you've mentioned a witness or stated that the incident took place in front of others, the possibility of that person having to be interviewed or having to make a statement could possibly take place, which brings them into the scenario, which if you're not prepared for that, you may misconstrue that as, oh, they're not, managing my information well. They're not being confidential about what I'm talking to them about. HR, I feel like, said something to this person that sits in my area, and yes, they were a witness, but now I feel like they're talking about it to other people. And confidentiality has to be explained in its entirety to every person involved, even witnesses. You're being brought into this investigation, but this is not a conversation for you to take outside of this setting, whether that's at the lunchroom, at the water, wherever. Even though you are a witness and it's not your personal grievance, in our ability to try to keep this as close to the chest and vest as possible until it has been resolved. And even after, you can't just have a conversation because you are now a party brought into it. And I've seen that happen where the confidentiality hasn't necessarily been broken between the employer, manager, and the employee, but by those outside parties that are necessary in order to prove the grievance, but then violate the confidentiality of the person that is filing it because they're having a sidebar over here, or the witness and the person that's being accused of having an altercation or something comes from there. So I do believe at the beginning, and this goes to training as well, and understanding in your role as supervisor, HR, or manager, that you have to make sure you convey the importance of everyone maintaining their confidentiality in the scenario place.
I completely agree. Absolutely.
It's unfortunate that it happens. And again, sometimes I've had a witness say, "Oh, I didn't know. I mean, you called me in here, so I thought I said what I had to say, but that's my friend. They're not gonna say nothing to nobody." People pillow talk. You have a lot of in-office relationships that take place that you may not know. Pillow talking is happening there, but it does. Even for your managers, I've seen managers overstep and violate the confidentiality portion of things because they are involved with another staff member. It could be a completely different department, but all the time your secret is not safe who you think it is in a workplace environment. So you have to,
yeah,
I mean, you really do. And that is very important because it changes the culture. And again, it can change how the responsibility shifts in the incident itself, and who ends up being, the person that's actually doing the violation or the violating of the grievance. And you could have this, like, this is clear cut, we know what we have to do with this employee, and then you have somebody change the trajectory of the process because they stepped outside of what the steps are in the investigative scenario. So that is very important. And again, diving into the next poll question, I think we can touch base on it a little bit more towards the end. Reporting mechanisms. Do you feel your employees trust the mechanisms in place for reporting harassment and discrimination? This was one of the ones that we posted earlier in the week, and no was the only answer that we got. And it really saddens me to know this, but it's reality. I mean, most employees there's already a broken level of trust between employee and employer, between employees and HR at times. So knowing that they can't trust the reporting mechanisms, it probably starts with they don't even know what they are.
Right.
And are they confidential? I mean, these platforms they have out here for a hotline for a monthly is less than you buying Chick-fil-A Friday for everybody. So it should be prioritized for companies to, pay for the little subscription, have that hotline so that it's a non-biased situation. They evaluate and then they send it to who your director of HR is. And then within your company, you can scale down on who needs to be involved and who does not. But if you can't trust the reporting process, we can't get anywhere else in the investigation. You know what I'm saying? So I think that that is a really big one for companies that they really need to look into. I mean, as an HR consultant, it is something that I always bring up during my HR audits if I don't already see it in place. Hey, and I stress it's my best recommendation for you. Of course, you don't have to take it, but it would definitely streamline that process. So whenever something comes up, and because it's not something that comes up fairly often, people don't necessarily see the justification in the purchase. But the moment you need it to be in play and it's not, and now you have bias place because you did not have the proper protocols, it becomes an issue that you need HR to come up. So that's my perspective on that topic. What about you, Countries?
I agree with having the correct outlet and being very clear about it. If it's not supposed to be confidential in the means of reporting these things, I know there's resources within some of these organizations or their policy, doesn't necessarily state there's a way for you to remain anonymous when reporting these, because they do actually want to know, given the level of severity of these complaints, who it's coming from, how to handle it appropriately, versus trying to figure out who it came from if you do it anonymously. But I think if you are a culture that supports, submitting these things anonymous and truly, recognize that it has to be anonymous when you do, have that in your policy as means for employees to report these grievances, then what's the other outlet? Is it, like I said, is it an email to HR? Some shared inbox that they have to where anyone on the HR team can pick it up and help you as you navigate through that situation. What does it look like? What is that process to make sure it's just clearly defined? So my experience has been both. Sometimes it's really clearly communicated because this employer has been through it several times. Mm-hmm. They cleaned up the policy. They've made it more streamlined to where, it makes sense and it flows well, versus others who, like you said, haven't gone through it as often, struggle to pick it up when it does happen. But it's better to be proactive than reactive. It's better to have that revisited as often as you can, periodically, to make sure it makes sense and it's updated so that in the event the employee does feel comfortable coming forward and reporting these grievances, they know exactly what to do. So
I agree. One of the things I think we were having an offline conversation not too long ago when it comes to workplace investigations, how important it is for employers to really assess the participants involved. I know it's kind of off topic from one of our talking points, but it drives me, I bring it up because it drives me back to the employee's level of trust, and not just in the mechanisms, but in the confidentiality. Because if the HR representative is afraid to advocate for the employee, even when they are clear and very calm, understand what is right and wrong in the situation, that changes how the investigation takes place. So having, a third party person or a consultant address your work investigations, depending on what the severity of the situation is, may be something employers need to look at, because if the HR person is a W-2 employee as well, it's only so much of the envelope they're going to push if they're getting pushback from upper management or ownership. And some owners, unfortunately, can't see it from all lenses. And again, HR's job is to expose the risk, that the company may be it could possibly experience based off of multiple perspectives in the scenario. And those are hard conversations sometimes for people in managerial roles, supervisor roles, or HR to have to push back against the person signing your check, or the person that you report to. So
Yeah.
having that third party person involved, or outside, a consulting company involved in workplace investigations, can also be a tool to stress to your staff that the proper protocols are taking place. You don't have to worry about, I know my manager is a pushover for her boss, and so she's not going to be combative with her boss. She's not going to stand her ground with her boss. So I don't even need to take it to her, because I know she's not going to back me, and I am right, or I am experiencing this. Or you have those employees that have tenure, they've been there so long, and nothing ever happens to them. Yes, everybody knows they're out of pocket, but that's just John. That's just what John does. You'll get used to it. Those type of situations. That's not good. That is not correct. And if John is ever brought into an investigation, the person can't be afraid. If you're supposed to be helping me mitigate this situation, you can't be afraid to address John if John is wrong. And that's where that third party person can come into play. And I think a lot of companies find themselves doing workplace investigation incorrectly because there is a bias that's there. The bias, and sometimes a slight fear, because everybody has their bills to pay. No one's trying to ruffle the feathers of someone over them, and then that creates unnecessary tension, which is a whole nother HR problem in itself. That happens because there's no retaliation. Person that's creating a grievance, or the person that's having that grievance to your attention. But there are plenty of places where that happens, and it's the workplace investigation process is just not being done correctly. Or again, you have the wrong personnel in place. They may be very good at their job when it comes to your bottom line of production, but they may not be good when it comes to this component. When workplace investigations and being able to properly handle grievances, especially if it involves them, or their department, or their work bestie, work bestie, that's my work wife, work husband. And I know I could never see them doing that. It doesn't matter if you can see them doing that or not. You have to thoroughly investigate the situation. And I've seen so many companies, fall short when it comes to their employees, because you have the buddy scenarios with the person that's performing the investigation. But I know that was a little off topic, but that was just my 2 cents, because I think it definitely impacts from the employer perspective. And sometimes the bigger the company, upper management may not even know that's taking place. Or on the high C level of executives, they may not know this manager and that employee have this relationship, but you're still in charge of the investigation that they're a part of. There should be no bias there. And I know it's hard. You with people at work all day, 5 days a week. You spend a lot of your time with them. Friendships, do develop. But when you are in a managerial role, there have to be clear lines, at times. So when scenarios like this come about, you don't find yourself stuck, or knowing when to, take yourself off of it. Like, we have to bring in someone else, because I do have this level of involvement with this person, at work or outside of work. And I would be creating a bias if I'm involved that could jeopardize, our position in the situation. What are your thoughts?
I completely agree. I think the accountability factor is lost too when you're dealing with, buddies. Like you said, this manager, nothing's going to happen to this manager if I report their behavior, because that obviously there's been a lot of turnover in their department. This person is constantly losing people, which are all major red flags. And yet this employee is scared to, come forward about some of the issues they're experiencing, because they're like, nothing's going to happen. This manager continues to do the thing. And so because of that, having that internal HR, and, as much as I'm sure they're going to take legal responsibility and do all they can to make sure that at least they follow the investigative process, they're still probably going to let that manager stay in their place, for several other reasons outside of, following the appropriate protocol. But because this person is well liked, because they hold this high position, whatever the case may be, So the accountability factor is lost. So I think having an external consultant is definitely helpful in these situations. So you're mitigating bias as much as possible, which you always want to do anyway.
Right.
But with the outside perspective, you get someone who has no ties to that employer or those employees. And so they're going to give you the truth and recommend some actions moving forward. So yeah, I agree.
I agree because mitigating bias and the accountability aspect of workplace investigations go into how the post investigation process is handled. Because if those things are not addressed, okay, investigation is over, this person is still here. A little slap on the wrist may or may not have taken place, but the original grievance doesn't stop. It may just transfer. You may take the person who requested the grievance out of that department and into another department, and then now your new hire is subjected to the same treatment because you never addressed the real elephant in the room, which is that manager or that person in leadership that has been there for so long, or because they're good at bringing your bottom line, keeping you in the black, you just let them do and let them go, but ultimately that will catch up to you. And in your position, leadership, managerial, supervisor role, ask yourself. Sometimes it takes some reflection. If you've had high turnover in your department, ask yourself why. Especially if you see people are being compensated the way they need to be compensated, and work life balance is taking place, there has to be something else that is going on. Now we know turnover most of the time is related to compensation, but outside of that, you have scenarios where you just have hard managers or difficult people to work for. And in those scenarios, who is addressing and making those, annual performance reviews? So this person, their review is great all the time, even though I know you've lost 5 people in the last 2 quarters. That doesn't make any sense. So there is a bias taking place, and it's already taking place with reviews and turnover. That means post an investigation, there's not really going to be a real result that happens that's beneficial to the person that filed the grievance or to the department as a whole. And that sometimes is so unfortunate in that post-investigative space, because when you file a grievance, ultimately you want to see some level of action take place on your behalf, especially if you're found to have been in the right in the situation, or to actually be experiencing whatever, if it's harassment or discrimination. Just, hey, John, we never want you to do this again. So please keep that in mind. We're very serious about it. And you're dismissed. That's not enough to make sure that it's not taking place. How are you measuring these investigations after they're closed? How are you reviewing them? How are you coming back as a manager, as an employer, and seeing, has there been any change since this investigation has taken place? I think the ball gets dropped post-investigative space a lot, because sometimes they can take months to get through and people just want to wash their hands. This was too much.
Yep.
I don't want no more parts of this. I'm so glad this is over, and on to whatever else. And you don't circle back to actually see, has there been any change take place since we made these changes in the department? Or if no changes were made in the department, what is the productivity level of the person that filed the grievance and the person that the grievance was filed on? Sometimes these investigations take a big toll on performance and how an employee tends to perform after that. Are you measuring this? Are you having touch bases and conversations with the parties involved, even witnesses? Because again, everybody was cool at the lunch table until you decided to be a witness, and now unnecessary tension over there has started to brew and to take place. And all it takes is for one person to feel some type of way, and we could be right down this path all over again with another grievance. So are you taking action from your role and your position in leadership to measure and go back and see if the decisions that were made, are they being held up? Are all parties being accountable? And are we still getting the productivity necessary? Or do we have to come back and readdress? Because if some things are dropping, things aren't working out, it doesn't just stop because all parties signed that final document. It takes a little bit more than that from the managerial side. What you think, Chantrice?
I completely agree with that. It's something I don't hear a lot about from some of the organizations that I've supported, or even, just being an independent HR consultant and helping, navigate some of these situations, is what happens post investigation. What does that process look like moving forward? And you brought up some really good points. I mean, is it measurable? If so, what does that look like if this person was moved into a different department or reporting to a new manager? If the problem still exists with if this person, the employee and not the manager, or there's still some other things that could come out of it, or if they're ultimately asking to separate amicably, what does that process look like on your end? If you do support that, what options do you give for severance, or whatever the case may be? Employers have to take that into consideration as well, especially if they just, like you said, kind of want to wash their hands of it. They don't want to have to deal with it. If this employee is asking for that as an option versus staying with the company, what does that look like? And do you understand what that could potentially do for anyone else who finds out, that I can just, ask for a severance and, report your ask for a severance. That's what I'm gonna do. I want to get up out of here. I don't want to work here anymore. I'm just gonna ask for a severance.
And we've seen that take place. Monkey see, monkey do real quick. If I think I could get paid, for something, but and you made a really good point, understanding what that looks like for you, and that where's your legal team? Legal needs to be brought in when those words are starting to be used. Nope, I'm uncomfortable. I don't want to be here, and we need to negotiate that. Or if a person feels like the grievance isn't necessarily being handled and the company isn't offering a level of a severance, now they're ready to take it to another level. All it takes is for somebody says, I'm gonna have my legal team contact you, or my counsel contact you. I mean, EEOC claims can be anonymous, so anybody can go and file the claim, and then now you have a whole nother scenario to deal with related to the workplace investigation, just because you may not have been doing it correctly, or not taking it as serious as you should be taking it based on what the original grievance is. So we have seen that. And I mean, ultimately, all of our talking points today are just eye openers and make you think, hey, let me take a look at what my processes and policies look like so that I can avoid some of these scenarios from happening. And again, they may come few and far in between, but one large fine can, change the trajectory of your company overall. And overall, even though people in managers or managerial positions like to say, well, this is not my company. Yeah, but if you as the manager are doing it wrong, you can be sued as well. I think people misconstrue that in certain scenarios, only the company can be sued. Depending on what your role is, your level of responsibility within the company in that department, and again, what role you played in the original grievance, sometimes you can be sued personally as well. So again, the onus is still on you to make sure when you're involved in these investigations that you're doing your part and your due diligence correctly. And if the company has not provided you with the necessary resources, you need to make sure you're communicating and documenting that as well, that you're not put into that basket when it hits the fan, because it won't matter sometimes, just depending on what the case is.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
It definitely can it can be a bad day sometimes depending on what the situation is. But that is all we have today for part 2 of workplace investigations from an employer / manager perspective. So we love to get you guys' comments even after, if you're rewatching this, and if you have any, we'll definitely respond. And sometimes your comments even prompt our next talking point. So again, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.